This episode was suggested by Christy O. and several other listeners. If you'd like to suggest a topic, you can do so on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast, on Twitter at Morbid Podcast, and on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. If you'd like to become a patron of the MCP, go to bit.ly/morbidpatron. That's bit.ly/morbidpatron, and you can support us for as little as $1 an episode. This episode contains discussions of death by contagious disease. I want to emphasize that the plague is very treatable today with antibiotics, so there's no need to panic over this disease. After this advice, if contagious disease is still something you don't want to hear about, this may be a good episode to skip. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so, the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped hundreds of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. Today, plague is a term that breeds fear as well as fascination. It means sickness, devastation, and sorrow. The plague is used to denote a dangerous contagious disease, but also several periods of history in which the populations of the world were devastated by a disease they could neither identify nor treat. Then and now, the plague is something that people fear without really understanding. Most people only associate the plague with the Black Death, a pandemic event that took hold of Europe in the 1300s. But the plague has been around for much longer and still exists today, though it's now treatable thanks to the wonders of modern medicine. Still, without treatment, the plague is often fatal, and in the past, it wrought havoc and ruin upon the people of Europe, Asia, and Africa. In this two-part episode, I want to talk about the three major historical pandemics that were caused or likely caused by the plague. The first pandemic, also known as the Plague of Justinian. The second pandemic, also known as the Black Death, which includes the Great Plague of London. And the third pandemic, sometimes called the Plague of Bombay. We will discuss the origins of the disease, how it travels, the symptoms associated, and the social, political, and economic effects caused by these pandemics. But before we get into the pandemics themselves, let's talk about what the plague actually is. The plague is an infection caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, a rod-shaped pathogen belonging to the Enterobacteriaceae family. It's a zoonotic disease, usually only found among feral rodents, which is spread mainly by fleas. The disease can only spread to humans under specific conditions, which I'll get to in a moment. Yersinia pestis bacteria causes a mutation in the gut of the flea, creating a biofilm. Blood and Yersinia pestis bacteria collect in this biofilm, blocking the digestive tract just before the midgut of the flea. Because of this blockage, when the flea takes in a blood meal, it cannot enter the gut, and the flea gets no sustenance. The bacteria breaks off from the blockage into the ingested blood, and as the meal has nowhere to go, it's regurgitated by the flea back into whatever animal it was feeding on, carrying the bacteria. The flea, however, is still hungry, so it bites aggressively, trying desperately to feed, therefore spreading the infection. The survival of Yersinia pestis bacteria depends on two populations of rodents living side by side, one that is resistant to the bacteria but can carry it, and one that becomes infected, feeding the flea and breeding more of the bacteria. Yersinia pestis can also change and adapt into different strains. These strains evolve depending on what the bacteria needs to survive. For example, if the rat population dies off, the bacteria must adapt in order to infect other animals by finding new hosts, such as humans. The pathogenesis, or how Yersinia pestis infection causes illness in humans, is multifaceted. First, Yersinia pestis can suppress and avoid normal immune system responses, such as phagocytosis, where the white blood cells absorb and destroy pathogens, and antibody production, where the body makes specific proteins to neutralize pathogens. Yersinia pestis also stalls the blood clotting process, which makes sure the bacterium makes its way easily into the wound created by the flea bite. The bacteria then travels to the lymph nodes, where it avoids destruction by immune response cells. In the lymph nodes, it begins to multiply. In human infections, the plague manifests in 4 possible forms: bubonic, pneumonic, septicemic, and abortive. Bubonic and pneumonic plague are the most common forms and are probably the ones you've heard of. Bubonic plague, named for the distinctive pus-filled buboes or gravicciolo it produces, is passed to humans through the bite of an infected flea or through exposure to the body fluids of an infected person. Within 2 to 7 days, symptoms begin to appear, which include malaise or unease, high fever, headaches, joint pain, vomiting, dizziness, and of course, buboes, lymphatic node and vessel swellings in the areas closest to the flea bite, usually the groin, neck, or underarms. These buboes can swell up to a diameter of about 4 inches or 10 centimeters and can change color over the course of the disease, eventually going black due to internal bleeding inside the lymph node. The person also becomes malodorous or smells of death. It was found during the 3rd pandemic that draining these sores vastly improved chances of survival, and I'll get into why in a moment. Bubonic plague progresses very quickly, and without treatment, most infected people die within a week after becoming ill. Pneumonic plague occurs when the pathogen spreads to the lungs. This is called secondary pneumonic plague. Primary pneumonic plague occurs when the pathogen is spread from person to person through water droplets expelled by coughing or sneezing. The incubation period, or time between infection and the first symptoms appearing, is around a few hours to a day. Symptoms include high fever, coughing, and coughing up blood. Without treatment, pneumonic plague is fatal between 2 and 5 days after symptoms appear. The mortality rate of pneumonic plague is higher than bubonic plague, but with modern medical treatment, the survival rate is still quite good. The deadliest form of the plague is septicemic plague. Without treatment, which includes draining the buboes, bubonic plague can lead to septicemic plague, where the pathogens move from the bubosores into the bloodstream. Through the bloodstream, the pathogen infects the entire body. The bacteria cause clotting in the tissues, which starves them of oxygenated blood, effectively causing death to the tissue, or ischemic necrosis. The blockages also cause large-scale internal bleeding in the skin and the organs as the blood seeps around the clots. The limbs can go black and hard as the tissues die. Septicemic plague is the most dangerous form of the disease and is almost always fatal if left untreated. However, it's also the rarest form of the plague. Abortive plague, on the other hand, is the least drastic of the 4 forms. Symptoms include a mild fever and some swelling in the lymph nodes. Most importantly, this version of the disease provides long-term immunity to the plague once the victim recovers. The bacterium Yersinia pestis was discovered independently by Alexander Yersin, a Swiss and French bacteriologist, and German-trained bacteriologist Kitasato Shibasaburo in 1894 during the 3rd pandemic as it hit Hong Kong. Yersin received the credit, however, as he also linked the bacteria to the disease. He named it Pasteurella pestis, after Louis Pasteur, whose methodology Yersin followed. It was renamed Yersinia pestis in 1967 in Alexander Yersin's honor. In 1898, French scientist Paul-Louis Simon revealed the rat flea vector of transmission. Plague reservoirs, or foci, are areas in which the plague is sustained within a rodent colony and exists naturally. Plague foci exist on all continents of the world, excluding Australia. According to most research, including the mapping of the evolutionary tree of all strains of the pathogen, it's likely that Yersinia pestis originated in Eurasia and was then transmitted from rat colony to rat colony, or migrated with displaced colonies of rats until it arrived in the Middle East. There, black rats and their fleas, Xenopsilla chiapis, which are native to the region, became infected. It is this subset that's thought to have spread the plague into human populations during the Black Death and possibly during the Plague of Justinian. It's possible Yersinia pestis is far older than previously thought and may have caused pandemics before the Plague of Justinian in the 6th century CE. One 2018 study found evidence that indicated the pathogen may have contributed to the Neolithic decline, in which European populations declined significantly between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago. That would push the date the plague appeared to much earlier and could indicate that Yersinia pestis originates in Europe instead of Eurasia. It's difficult to determine its true origins, however, as it occurred in the ancient past, but many researchers are still looking for this answer. Wherever it originated, the pathogen spread over time, and plague foci developed in several locations in Europe, the Middle East, India, Iran, and eventually Central Africa. These foci could have developed well before the Plague of Justinian or after. The plague is still commonly found today in sub-Saharan Africa and Madagascar. These regions account for around 95% of all reported human cases. As the plague is first a disease of rodents, it remains detrimental to several groups of non-human mammals. In the United States, for example, the black-tailed prairie dog and the black-footed ferret are currently under threat from the plague. There is so much more to bacterium Yersinia pestis that I can't include it all, despite how incredibly interesting it is. I recommend reading Chapter 103 of Molecular Medical Microbiology, Volume 3, edited by Robert R. Brubaker. But I warn you, while interesting, it's heavy reading. While still present in the world today, the plague is easily avoided through hand washing, good personal hygiene, and cleanly surroundings. If it is contracted by a human, antibiotics plus supportive care are key to recovery. The symptoms today are also less severe when compared to the accounts from the Black Death, especially in the case of bubonic plague. This is likely because the bacterium has changed over the 8 centuries that have passed since the Black Death and 15 centuries since the Plague of Justinian. The human landscape has also changed, and while there are more humans on the earth now than there were then, most are living in more hygienic conditions and are aware of how germs are transmitted, making it easier to avoid becoming infected. But this was not the case during the 3 great plague pandemics, especially during the time of the Plague of Justinian and the Black Death. As we will cover the Black Death and the 3rd pandemic in part 2 of this episode, let's discuss the first pandemic, the Plague of Justinian. This was the first historically documented pandemic in which the symptoms were described, as well as its path across Europe, Africa, and Asia. But before we jump in, let's pause for a word from our sponsors.
Hello everyone, let me tell you about the Apple for the Teacher podcast. I'm Anna Thomas, a teacher and your host. So you're probably thinking it's about reading, writing and arithmetic, right? Well, think again. It's a fresh take on true crime, where you wouldn't expect to find true crime. In schools, yes, schools. You will hear tragic stories about murder, abduction, school bus hijack, student disappearance, suicide, kidnap and ransom, a school camp tragedy, the list goes on. So if you're looking for something a little different in the true crime genre, then Apple for the Teacher is for you. So join me as I present the bad apples. But until then, remember to be a good apple.
Lastly, if you like this podcast, why not sponsor the MCP yourself by becoming a patron on Patreon? Over 30,000 people download this podcast every month, but only around 90 people are supporting us on Patreon. For a mere $1 an episode, that's $2 a month, you can get ad-free episodes, bonus behind-the-scenes info, give your opinion by answering polls, help choose episodes, and get updates on past episodes. For $3 an episode, you get monthly outtake reels. For $5, you get a monthly quiz episode where I quiz my husband on past episodes. For $10, you get a detailed bibliography of all the resources I used while researching each topic. And for $20, you get a bit of miscellaneous morbidity, a short essay on a random morbid topic every month. Previously, we've reviewed horror video games, discussed the medicine of Westeros, and the plague pits of London. All of these rewards aside, your patronage supports the podcast and keeps new episodes coming. I can't keep doing this podcast without you, so go to bit.ly/morbidpatron, that's bit.ly/morbidpatron, to choose your rewards and support the MCP. You'll have my eternal gratitude. And now, back to the podcast. The Plague of Justinian is recorded by several classical writers as occurring in the 6th century CE. Justinian was the ruler of the Byzantine Empire, which is sometimes referred to as the Eastern Roman Empire or Byzantium. With its capital at Constantinople or modern Istanbul, the Byzantine Empire survived the breakup of the Roman Empire in the 5th century CE and continued to exist until it fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. Unlike the Roman Empire, Christianity became the state religion, and pagans were persecuted. During the reign of Justinian, which occurred between 527 and 565 CE, the empire reached its greatest extent after conquering much of what used to be the Roman Empire in the Mediterranean. The first references to the plague come from the Mediterranean. The Byzantine writer and scholar Procopius of Caesarea stated that the plague was first noted at an Egyptian port near what is now known as Suez, but was then called Pelusium, in late 541, early 542 CE. It then moved to the largest city on the Nile Delta, in Egypt, Alexandria, and then on to Palestine. It arrived in Constantinople on ships carrying grain from Egypt. From there, Procopius said it spread to the rest of the world. As Constantinople was a very important trading route and no one understood how the disease was transmitted, trade was not halted during this plague. Several waves of the plague were reported to pass over the Mediterranean for around 200 years afterwards, usually every 8 to 12 years. It was said the decimation wrought by it reduced the tensions between the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire, which were at war at the time, and caused a drop in agriculture and the economy due to sheer number of lives lost. It's said the Plague of Justinian even halted the reconsolidation of the Roman Empire, thus ending the age of antiquity and beginning the Middle Ages. However, there is still some debate about how much the plague actually contributed to this, but I'll get into that in a moment. At this time, most medical writing concentrated on the medical practices of the ancient Greeks, such as Galen, who favored humorism, or the four humors system of medicine. Many writers at the time simply regurgitated these older writings or translated them into local languages, such as Syriac or Arabic. Tracking a single disease and its progression was not common. Procopius, on the other hand, documented this plague extensively, tracking its symptoms, its progression, and its spread. He wrote that it began with a sudden fever, bubonic swellings in the armpits and below the thighs. Some infected people died straight away, while others sank into a coma or a state of exhaustion, delirium, paranoia, insomnia, and were unable to recognize friends. Some victims vomited blood. Black pustules about the size of a lentil appeared on some victims, and Procopius wrote that this was a sure sign of imminent death. Procopius also observed that it was a plague, quote, by which the whole human race came near to be annihilated, end quote. The cause was unknown, and no known treatments seemed to help. The people most at risk of death were children and pregnant women. If victims survived, they were often left with a permanent speech impediment, such as lisps or incoherent speech. However, Procopius noted that when those who recovered cared for other victims of the plague, they seemed immune to reinfection. During its peak, which was around the spring of 542 CE, Procopius stated that the plague killed around 10,000 people in Constantinople every day. Today, it's thought that this was likely an exaggeration, as if it were true, the city would have been empty within weeks. However, it's likely the mortality rate was substantial. Procopius reported that the victims were too numerous to be buried, so the bodies of the dead were left stacked in churches and the towers along the city walls. There were so many deaths that funerals weren't able to be performed, and that Christian doctrine prevented the bodies from being cremated. According to Procopius, the entire city reeked of death. In his book Secret History, Procopius reported that Emperor Justinian responded poorly to the large loss of life. The emperor still demanded the annual tax from the farmers of his empire, and to make up for the money he wouldn't receive from the devastated farms, he demanded more from those left alive. Two other writers also recorded this plague: John of Ephesus, a Syrian monk and historian, and Evagrius Scholasticus, a Syrian church scholar who survived the plague as a child while living in Antioch. John of Ephesus reported that the disease had hit the interior of India before spreading to Pelusium, and Evagrius said it began somewhere in Ethiopia, all places that border the Red Sea. However, the symptoms they record differ slightly from those of the bubonic plague. The glandular swellings were present, but these authors also reported bloodshot eyes, swollen faces, extremely sore throats, and black spots on the skin. At the time, and for a long time afterwards, almost all the way up until germ theory took hold at the end of the 19th century, sickness was often thought to be due to supernatural forces, such as the gods punishing the wicked or witches working evil spells against their enemies. However, most natural disasters, including some epidemics, were thought to be natural in the 6th century. The Plague of Justinian, while observed in a very scientific way, was so destructive that it was blamed on the wrath of God. Emperor Justinian was blamed by some writers, including Procopius. They thought that either his life of excess and cruelty had brought down God's wrath upon the people, or that Justinian had created the plague and released it into the world. Justinian himself actually contracted the plague and survived. There are many theories as to how the plague came to the Mediterranean, as it didn't occur there naturally at the time. 2 decades before the Justinian plague, the Mediterranean was in a state of upheaval due to warfare and a shift in the trade routes, which brought silks from India to Byzantium. There is little evidence other than the word of John of Ephesus that states there was plague in India before Pelusium, but if this were true, it would suggest the plague originated there. This is a possibility, as it was discovered in 2015 through DNA phylogenetic mapping of Yersinia pestis that one of the older strains of plague is naturally occurring in rodents in East Asia. Just a few years before the Plague of Justinian, in 535 and 536 CE, extreme weather conditions were reported. Procopius stated that the sun had lost its brightness, and a veil or haze seemed to hang in the air. Widespread crop failures were reported in China and Ireland, dense fog in the Middle East, China and Europe, and an intense drought in Peru. These written reports have been confirmed by an analysis of tree ring data from that time period, in which the rings that are laid down yearly by the growth of the trees show signs of environmental stress. It's possible these environmental changes sent rodents which carried the plague into new habitats where humans also resided, the perfect conditions for the plague to spread to humans. In 2018, several ancient and modern strains of Yersinia pestis were found to be closely related to the ancestor of the Justinian plague. These reservoirs of plague were found in Tian Shan, a mountain range on the borders of Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and China. This suggests that the Justinian plague may have originated around that region. It was also found that the strain responsible for the Black Death was not the same strain that has been found in skeletons that died of the plague during the Plague of Justinian. Either a rodent colony that was a reservoir for the plague was forced to leave their habitat due to environmental changes, such as a very wet year or a war-torn landscape, or some of the infected rodents were unintended passengers along the new trade routes headed to Byzantium. Either way, the plague-carrying fleas moved from rodents to humans, and the pandemic began. It's been estimated that the Plague of Justinian killed around 1/3 of the population of Europe and the Mediterranean. However, true mortality rates remain uncertain. It's very difficult to determine the death rate, as almost 1,500 years have passed and many skeletons and writings have been degraded or lost, giving us an imperfect view of the archaeology and documentation. Recently, there has been some doubt thrown over the degree of devastation caused by the Plague of Justinian. A study from 2019 by Mordecai et al. Has actually called into question how devastating the Plague of Justinian was, by reporting that there isn't actually that much more evidence for this plague other than the writings of Procopius, John of Ephesus, and Evagrius Scholasticus. Later writers reference these three, therefore taking their word that this plague was incredibly devastating. Procopius, John of Ephesus, and Evagrius Scholasticus all wrote that the plague had a massive effect on the social and economic landscape, but the archaeological evidence, as reported by Mordecai et al., doesn't support such a large disruption. Land use went unchanged, according to their analysis of ancient pollen, and written administerial papyri written during that time don't reference the plague. Coinage production and currency value didn't change either, which would have certainly happened if trade was interrupted. As for skeletal DNA evidence, only about 45 individuals have been found from this time period that contain the DNA of Yersinia pestis, and all were from Central and Western Europe. It's possible the plague DNA has degraded so much that it's undetectable, but Mordecai et al. Argue that there's still a lack of mass graves from that period, or at least they don't exist in the same numbers as seen during the Black Death, which has been shown unequivocally to have had massive social and economic effects all across the areas it affected. There is documented evidence from Islamic, Chinese, and European writers that several waves of the plague did strike parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa throughout the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries CE. These outbreaks occurred at a much smaller level, however, and with a much lower mortality rate. After the last known wave ended in 750 CE, pandemics on the scale of the Plague of Justinian did not appear again in Europe until the Black Death of the 14th century. So, while there is some debate, most historians agree that the Plague of Justinian was the first pandemic of the plague and resulted in a loss of around 33% of the population surrounding the Mediterranean. However, the only 100% proven incident of Yersinia pestis alone causing a pandemic is the third pandemic, which occurred at the end of the 19th century. Yersinia pestis likely caused the Plague of Justinian, and definitely contributed to the Black Death, but as this event occurred before microscopy and germ theory, we don't know for sure if it was the only disease responsible. But we'll get into that in Part 2. If you'd like to know more about the Plague of Justinian, I'd recommend reading Will Rosen's book, Justinian's Flea, Plague, Empire, and the Birth of Europe. It's a bit tangential in places, but overall tells the history quite well. In Part 2, we will discuss the Black Death, the Plague of London, and the Third Pandemic. So until next time, keep up that spark of curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast was produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic for me to talk about, you can tweet the show at Morbid Podcast or find us on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast. If you like the show, please share us on social media. And please give us a rating on iTunes. Your shares and ratings help us reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who commented, suggested topics, shared MCP posts, liked or followed the MCP on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and gave us ratings on iTunes. People like Victoria H., Nurse Tori, Lapling, Scarlet Darlingness, Robachevsky, Ella Hella, Zukski, Richard, Nicholas, Sarah, Charlene, Siberian Penguin, and forever yours, Kelly. John has my eternal gratitude for becoming a patron. Thank you, John. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing, especially on Facebook, so head over there to engage with other listeners, discuss episodes and news articles, and share your own creepy stories and cute pet pictures. The MCP is part of a wider creepy community known as the Belfry Podcast Network. Check out the other shows on the Belfry Network at www.thebelfry.rip. As I said before, if you really like the MCP, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. You can also give one-time donations by going to our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com, and clicking the donate button. On our website, you can also find links to all our social media and sponsors, and other ways to contact us. If you'd rather contact us by mail, this address is also listed on the website. Another way to help the show is by going to our Amazon wish list at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.